dictator Stalin gave his troops the right to do whatever they want to do.
There are photographs that simply record history, and then there are photographs that rewrite it. Most wartime images fade into archives, cataloged and forgotten, their secrets sealed beneath layers of dust and indifference. But every so often, one image refuses to stay silent. One image surfaces decades later and forces the world to stop, look closer, and confront something it was never supposed to see. This is the story of one such photograph, a single black and white frame from the darkest chapter of the 20th century, one that lay buried for nearly 80 years before modern technology finally cracked it open. What historians found when they zoomed and left seasoned researchers speechless, and what it revealed about one woman's courage, identity, and fate is a story that history almost succeeded in erasing forever. In the spring of 2022, a small team of archival researchers, working under a European historical preservation initiative, was quietly digitizing thousands of uncatalogued wartime documents stored in a regional repository in Warsaw, Poland. The collection had been largely untouched since the early 1950s, its contents considered low priority, mostly administrative paperwork, damaged film reels, and loose photographic prints too degraded to seem significant. But tucked between two brittle folders, sealed inside a plain paper envelope with no label, was a single photographic print measuring roughly 4 by 6 inches. The image showed a street scene in what appeared to be an occupied European city. In the foreground, 3 uniformed German soldiers stood in a loose formation around a lone woman. She was dressed in a dark, well-tailored coat, standing upright with her chin slightly raised. Her hands were visible at her sides, relaxed, unshaking. Around her, the soldiers carried rifles, their postures rigid and authoritative. One appeared to be issuing a command. The woman, however, did not look broken or terrified. She looked composed, almost unnervingly so, as if she were the one in control of the moment, not them. At first, the researchers treated it as they would any other wartime photograph. They logged it, scanned it at standard resolution, and moved on. But something about the image kept drawing people back. A senior photo analyst on the team, reviewing the day's scans that evening, paused on it. There was something about the woman's expression, something about the geometry of the scene, that felt deliberately constructed rather than candidly captured. She flagged it for enhanced analysis. That decision would change everything. When the photograph was submitted for high-resolution digital enhancement, the process used was photogrammetric imaging, a technique originally developed for satellite cartography that had been adapted for forensic archival work. It works by reconstructing depth and detail from flat images using algorithms that assess light angles, shadow gradients, and surface texture. What it can reveal in an old photograph is extraordinary. Hidden text, obscured facial features, background details invisible to the naked eye. The first pass of enhancement focused on the soldier's insignia. What the analysts found was immediately puzzling. The sleeve markings on one of the soldiers belonged to a Wehrmacht auxiliary unit that had officially been dissolved and reassigned in early 1942, more than a year before the approximate date suggested by contextual clues in the photograph. This was not a minor clerical inconsistency. Unit insignia in the German military during World War II were strictly regulated and documented. A soldier wearing the markings of a disbanded unit was either a gross administrative error or evidence that something about the photograph's context was deliberately obscured. The second detail that emerged from the enhancement was even more striking. Around the woman's neck, partially hidden beneath the lapel of her coat, hung a small pendant. Once the image was sharpened and the contrast adjusted, the shape of that pendant became visible. It was a specific geometric symbol, not widely recognized in standard religious iconography of the era, but documented in a narrow body of academic literature relating to underground resistance communication in Eastern Europe during the occupation. Resistance cells sometimes used discrete symbols as identification markers among members. The pendant, if that interpretation was correct, was not jewelry. It was a signal. Analysts then turned their attention to the background of the image. Partially visible through a cracked shop window behind the soldiers was a reflection, faint, distorted, but recoverable. After multiple rounds of enhancement, a figure emerged in that reflection. Someone else had been present at the scene. Someone who was not in the primary frame. Someone who, by every indication, was watching. The question that now consumed the research team was fundamental. Who was she? Facial recognition technology, cross-referenced against digitized wartime records from Poland, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, returned no confirmed match. Her face did not appear in any known database of resistance members, documented prisoners, civilian deportees, or intelligence operatives from the period. She was, in every official sense, a ghost. But absence from the record, historians know, is itself a form of evidence. During World War II, certain individuals were deliberately removed from documentation, either by Nazi authorities seeking to conceal operations or by Allied intelligence protecting the identities of assets still in the field. A person who does not appear in wartime records is not necessarily a person who did not exist. They may simply be a person someone worked very hard to erase. Physical details in the photograph offered a separate line of inquiry. A textile specialist brought in to assess the woman's clothing noted that the stitching pattern and cut of her coat were consistent with Parisian tailoring techniques of the late 1930s, not Polish manufacturing of the same period. The fabric itself, based on visible weave density under enhancement, suggested a wool synthetic blend that was more commonly produced in Western Europe. For a woman to be wearing such a coat in Nazi-occupied Warsaw or Krakow in 1943 suggested either extraordinary privilege, an elaborate cover identity, or both. A small but significant detail on her left hand was also identified. A faint linear scar running diagonally across the back of the hand, between the knuckle of the index finger and the wrist. This scar was cross-referenced with a testimony collected in the late 1980s from a wartime survivor living in Montreal, Canada. That survivor, in a memoir that had never been commercially published, described a woman she had encountered briefly in occupied Poland, a woman who helped her obtain false papers and guided her toward a safe house network. She remembered the woman specifically because of a scar on her left hand. She had never learned the woman's name. It took the combined effort of researchers across 3 countries and nearly a year of archival work to arrive at a name. The name was not found in a Nazi record, nor in an Allied intelligence file. It surfaced in a handwritten letter, composed in German, discovered inside a miscellaneous collection donated to a historical society in Zurich in the early 1990s and never properly catalogued. The letter was written by a former German administrative official and addressed to an unnamed recipient. In it, the writer made a passing but specific reference to a female translator attached to a military logistics office who had come under suspicion in late 1943. He described her as multilingual, meticulous, and impossible to read. He referred to her by a single name, Marta Weilberg. Cross-referencing Marta Weilberg against wartime records produced sparse but consistent results. She appeared in 2 German administrative rosters from 1942 and early 1943, listed as a civilian interpreter assigned to military communications. She held the kind of position that would have placed her in regular proximity to sensitive information, troop movements, supply logistics, internal correspondence. She also held the kind of position that would have attracted almost no suspicion. Translators were necessary, interchangeable, and largely invisible to the operational hierarchy around them. But intelligence historians who reviewed the material offered a different reading. A civilian woman with proven multilingual ability, assigned to a sensitive communications role, wearing a resistance identification symbol beneath her coat in a photograph that was never meant to be discovered. The profile fit a pattern well documented in the history of wartime espionage. She was not simply a translator. She appears to have been a deeply embedded operative, using her official role as cover for intelligence work conducted on behalf of the resistance, and possibly for Allied intelligence networks operating in occupied Europe. What made her operation remarkable, if this interpretation is correct, was its duration. She appears to have maintained her cover from at least mid-1942 through late 1943, a period of more than a year in one of the most heavily surveilled environments in wartime Europe. The psychological endurance that required, and the operational discipline it demanded, place her in a category occupied by only a handful of confirmed wartime agents whose stories have been told. Once the identity question had been partially answered, Researchers returned to the photograph itself with fresh eyes. The scene it depicted no longer looked like a routine arrest. It looked like something else entirely. The soldier's body language, reanalyzed in light of the new information, was not consistent with the standard detention. They were not restraining her. They were not searching her. They appeared, in fact, to be engaged in what looked like a tense but controlled conversation. One soldier's posture, slightly turned, weight shifted back, suggested uncertainty rather than command. The woman's hands, hanging loose and open at her sides, showed no distress response. She was not in the grip of fear. She was managing the situation. The researcher who made this observation put it plainly in her written report. This photograph did not capture a woman being taken. It captured a woman holding her ground. The presence of the secondary figure in the reflected background, whoever had been watching from outside the frame, added another dimension to the reading. If this was an intelligence operation of some kind, there was a protocol at work. Someone was positioned to observe, to bear witness, or to intervene if necessary. The photograph itself may have been taken as documentation, not by the soldiers, and not for the official Nazi record, but by a member of the network. An image preserved not as propaganda, but as evidence. Marta Vale Berg, if that was truly her name, or one of her names, disappeared from every traceable record by the end of 1943. No arrest report, no deportation record, no death notice. The absence is total and, given its completeness, almost certainly deliberate. Several scenarios are historically plausible. She may have been arrested and processed outside official channels, a fate that befell a number of resistance operatives who were considered too sensitive for standard documentation. She may have been extracted by her network before capture became inevitable, moved along an underground route into neutral territory or into Allied-controlled zones. She may have assumed another identity entirely and lived out the remainder of her life under a name no researcher has yet connected to her. What the historical record cannot tell us, the photograph still quietly communicates. It shows a woman who, in a moment of enormous danger, chose to remain visible rather than invisible, who stood in front of armed soldiers and gave them nothing, not panic, not submission, not the confirmation of weakness they may have been looking for. Whatever happened after that moment, whatever became of her, the photograph preserves something the historical record tried to erase. The story of the woman in this photograph is, in the truest sense, unfinished. There is no confirmed ending, no archival document that closes the file. What there is a single image that survived nearly 80 years of obscurity, and within it, the trace of a life that was lived with extraordinary purpose and extraordinary risk in the most dangerous period of the 20th century. She is one of countless individuals whose contributions to the resistance against Nazism were never formally recognized, not because those contributions were minor, but because the nature of covert work demands anonymity, and history has a way of recording only what is permitted to be recorded. The enhanced photograph offers us a rare and accidental window into a world that was deliberately kept dark. Modern forensic technology gave researchers the tools to zoom in. What they found when they did was not merely a clearer image of a wartime scene. It was the outline of a person who refused to be erased. 80 years later, with better tools and sharper eyes, we are only beginning to understand what she was protecting and what it cost her to stand there, calm and unbroken, in front of the camera. Some truths are buried. Some, it turns out, are simply waiting for someone to look closely enough.